while we were figuring out the technical stuff. The great news is it is working. Not always the case, apparently, today. Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Dina. I'm from the Leadership Institute. We just thank you all for joining us for the boot camp section and the activism section of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference. Today with us, we've got one of the rising young stars. I get to be one of those few people that get to say I knew Amber back when. I had a moment, yeah, Amber, good. I had a momentary brain freeze. I was like, or is it Ashley? I knew Amber back when she worked for Campus Reform, which is Leadership Institute's online newspaper that exposes liberal bias on campus. She didn't stay very long at Campus Reform, I'm sad to say, mostly because other people recognized her immense talent. She got picked up by the Daily Caller. She was in charge during the Kavanaugh hearings of all their digital postings, and now she's just been upgraded to White House correspondent. I think she might have one of those elusive hard passes, so congratulations. We are so happy to have you. Everyone give it up for Amber Athey.
That was lovely, thank you. Hello, everyone, and let me apologize again for the technical issues. I can string sentences together, but I'm apparently incapable of understanding that keynote presentations don't work on PCs. But thank you all so much for coming. My presentation, see, technology, I don't know how to use it. I'm like a boomer when it comes to technology. My presentation is all about, in this era of fake news, in the Trump era where the media is constantly getting over its skis, how to create quality journalism, how to make sure that you're not reporting fake news. And as I was preparing this presentation, I thought to myself, what better way to teach people how to be journalists than to demonstrate all of the pieces of fake news that have come out in the Trump era and explain to you what not to do. So these are going to be a whole bunch of examples of all of the things that the media has gotten wrong over the past couple of years, what mistakes they made, and how to avoid them. So the first thing about journalism is your story selection. Ask yourself when you're choosing what stories to write, do people actually care about this issue? Does the average American want to read this story? And if not, why should they? And are you able to make them care about it? In this example, this was a story just from last week by Will Sommer of the Daily Beast about some QAnon conspiracy theory within the Trump administration. And then it turned out that this person that he was writing about was just a pastry chef. She had no policy experience. She had no hand in actually influencing anything within the Trump administration. I mean, the woman bakes cakes for a living, and yet somehow she became the poster child of conspiracy theories in the administration. So I want to read you guys a response to this story that I thought was pretty hilarious. Congrats, Will, but just ask yourself, did your parents put you through school so you could write about pastry chef hires? All the dreams you must have had about doing good for the world and becoming a good man, and this is what you do for a living? Consider therapy. Another great example of poor story selection is just a random tweet from Reuters Top News about a dog showing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez affection. I might expect a story like this from maybe TMZ or maybe even an AOC fan page on Facebook, but my guess is most people don't follow Reuters Top News for videos of dogs and congresswomen. At least that's my guess. So another aspect of story selection is knowing your audience, knowing what types of stories they're looking for and what they want to read. Then, of course, there's the dreaded case of missing context. There's an infamous story, CNN, others, all slammed Trump for apparently almost killing these koi fish during a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, because he had dumped all of his fish food into the pond at once. This video went absolutely viral that showed Trump tipping the box over, and everyone was worried that the fish were going to die. But then when you saw the full video, it turned out that Prime Minister Abe actually dumped his food into the pond first, and that Trump was simply following his lead. here's a video from Fox News explaining the whole fiasco. So this is obviously an important reminder that the things that surround an event are oftentimes just as important as the event itself, so that people can understand the full context of the situation. In the Trump era, we see a lot of journalists pretending that their own opinions are facts. Editorializing is a huge thing that journalists are doing now, where they present certain stories as if they're factual, but really it's just their own personal opinion. I think one of the most infamous examples of this over the past year was when CNN's Jim Acosta confronted Trump at a press conference about immigration. And I'm just going to play this clip for you and explain to you the various stages where he went wrong and inserted his own opinion into the story.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to challenge you on one of the statements that you made.
All right, so right off the bat, Acosta opens this exchange by saying, I want to challenge you, okay? That's not the job of a journalist. Obviously, you want to ask tough questions of leaders and hold them accountable, but journalists are also there on a fact-finding mission and to gather information. So when you start off an exchange by saying you want to challenge someone, you're already not setting the stage for gaining new information. You're setting yourself up for a personal battle.
In the tail end of the campaign, in the midterms,
Here we go.
If you don't mind, Mr. President, that this caravan was an invasion. As you know, Mr. President,
I consider it to be an invasion.
As you know, Mr. President, the caravan was not an invasion. It's a group of migrants moving up from Central America towards the border with the U.S.
Thank you for telling me that. I appreciate it.
Why did you characterize it as such?
Because I consider it an invasion. You and I have a difference of opinion.
But do you?
All right, so Trump hit the nail on the head right there when he said, you and I have a difference of opinion. Is the caravan an invasion? Republicans would argue that you have hundreds, thousands of people coming towards the southern border, attempting to climb border walls to get into the country. They classify that as an invasion. The Democrats disagree. They say illegal immigration overall has been declining over the past few years. They don't think it's an invasion. That's an opinion, and a partisan one at that. So for Acosta to broadly assert that it is not an invasion and then insist the president correct himself is him editorializing.
That you demonized immigrants in this election to try to keep them.
I want them to come into the country, but they have to come in legally. You know, they have to come in, Jim, through a process. I want it to be a process, and I want people to come in, and we need the people.
Your campaign.
Wait. You know why we need the people, don't you? Because we have hundreds of companies moving in. We need the people.
Right. But your campaign had an ad showing migrants climbing over walls and so on.
Well, that's true.
But
they weren't actors.
They're not going to be doing that.
They weren't actors.
All right, right there, Acosta said, your campaign had a video showing migrants climbing over walls. They're not going to be doing that. This is where his editorializing got him in trouble, because about a week after this, there was a migrant caravan that arrived in San Diego, rushed the border, and there was, in fact, video of many of them climbing the San Diego border wall. So, again, Acosta's opinion here ended up being proven wrong later, so he really got himself in trouble there.
You didn't know it?
No.
Someone actually snapped back at him and said, "See these people climb over walls?"
Right. Misleading headlines. I don't know if you guys remember this story. The New York Times wrote a story claiming that Nikki Haley had been responsible for these $50,000 curtains in her residency in the UN ambassador's apartment in New York City. The headline included Nikki Haley's name. There was a huge picture of her on the front of the story. But then as we found out, Nikki Haley wasn't responsible for the purchase at all. They were actually purchased under the Obama administration when Samantha Power was UN ambassador, and the purchase was already pre-made before Nikki Haley ever took office. The New York Times ended up correcting that story and indicating that they had made a mistake by pinning it on Nikki Haley. But another interesting part of this is Nikki Haley said that she actually told the New York Times this before they published the story. So they knew that these curtains were not her responsibility, and yet they still chose to make the headline about her rather than Samantha Power. And there's the editor's note, the very long editor's note that they put on the story. The article should not have focused on Miss Haley, nor should a picture of her have been used. Not conducting thorough research, pretty basic tenet of journalism. And unfortunately, in this case, CNN and The Hill got it wrong. They published a sexual assault claim against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh that had already been retracted by the time that they published it. And yet in both stories, it was not mentioned that the claim had already been retracted. They could have saved themselves the trouble of getting this wrong if they had simply Googled the man's name who was making the accusation. But apparently it was more important to rush to slam this Supreme Court nominee. So as you can see here, a Rhode Island man, his name was Jeffrey Catalan on Twitter, claimed that Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted a friend of his. But Catalan apologized for making the accusation and said that he made a mistake and that it was not true before CNN or The Hill ever ran with it. Google is your friend, folks. Not asking to see documents yourself. There was a major report that came out of CNN alleging that Don Jr. had advanced access to WikiLeaks documents during the presidential campaign. Obviously, these documents were stolen, and there were allegations that Don Jr. had engaged in illegality by having special access from WikiLeaks. This whole story centered on an email. Two sources apparently read the email to CNN and claimed that it was sent to Don Jr. on September 4th by someone giving him an encryption key to the stolen WikiLeaks documents before they were released to the general public. But the email wasn't sent on September 4th. As the Daily Caller News Foundation's Chuck Ross found out by simply asking for a copy of the email, it was sent on September 14th, which was one day after the WikiLeaks documents were already released to the public, meaning that Don Jr. had apparently done nothing wrong. Mischaracterizing your sources. In this report, Brian Karam, who is a correspondent for Playboy, that picture is semi-hilarious, he published a report claiming, again in the Kavanaugh era, which was a huge trove of fake news left and right, that Montgomery County investigators were looking into a second sexual assault claim against Judge Brett Kavanaugh. So everyone assumed that he was talking about police investigators, investigators with the county. I asked him about this on Twitter, and he said, well, you're making a mistake by assuming that the police are my source. But any rational person reading Montgomery County investigators would assume that that means they're investigators with the county. He later corrected the story to indicate that they were, quote, investigators in Montgomery County. Which means what exactly? An investigator in Montgomery County could be, I don't know, a PI, someone who has access to Google. We really have no idea. And unfortunately, the mischaracterization of Brian's sources made the story practically worthless. And you can see the story was edited without an editor's note, which is important to indicate changes of that magnitude. When you're reporting on stories, you often make agreements with your sources, whether you are talking to them on the record, on background, are you speaking off the record? And the Associated Press ran a story where they had an agreement with Representative Martha McSally, who was running for Senate in Arizona. And there was an audio recording of their interview with McSally, where at one point, the reporter asked if they could switch to on background, which means they could use the things that McSally was giving them, but they couldn't attribute them to her directly, and they couldn't quote her. Yet when the piece was published, they took the things that they agreed were on background and put them on the record and quoted them as if they were just like the rest of the interview. It's especially interesting for the reporter to break that agreement here because he was the one who asked to go on background in the first place. Sometimes a source will request to go on background, but if the journalist doesn't agree to those conditions, then it's not really a binding ethical contract. But in this case, the reporter asked first, McSally agreed, and yet he still broke that agreement, which is highly unethical. I would venture as well that this journalist probably has a harder time speaking to sources now because he's shown that he can't be trusted to honor the agreements that they make. Stories based on one anonymous source. I hear a lot of things from conservative media claiming that anonymous sources are bad. I don't think that's true. I use anonymous sources all the time. Pretty much every reporter you ever talk to will use anonymous sources. They're really important for getting out sensitive stories. However, one anonymous source, and you're playing a dangerous game, because this person has free reign to say whatever they want, knowing that their name's never going to be attached to it, and they have no one else to corroborate it. In this case, CNN had perhaps their biggest fake news story when they claimed that Anthony Scaramucci was under investigation in relation to the probe into Russian collusion in the Trump campaign. The story was based on one anonymous source, later turned out to be false, and I believe 3 CNN reporters, Darcy, you can confirm, resigned because of that story. Sitting on news. There's a saying in news that 2 days is too old. In this case, we were about 2 weeks before NBC published a story that could have partially exonerated Judge Brett Kavanaugh during his hearings. There was a story related to Kavanaugh from a woman named Julie Swetnick, who was represented by Democratic porn lawyer Michael Avenatti. And Julie Swetnick claimed that she had seen Kavanaugh at multiple gang rape parties, and that when she saw him at these parties, she continued attending. She went to 10 of them, apparently. NBC spoke to a woman who was supposed to corroborate Julie Swetnick's story. This woman was provided by Michael Avenatti as someone who could bolster her claims. NBC spoke to her when the hearings for Kavanaugh were still ongoing, and she indicated that Avenatti was not truthful about what she said about Kavanaugh. She said, "It is incorrect that I saw Brett spike the punch. I didn't see anyone spike the punch. I was very clear with Michael Avenatti from day one." She then accused him of twisting her words. Yet, Kavanaugh wasn't confirmed to the Supreme Court until October 6th, 2 days after NBC already knew that this woman would not support Julie Swetnick's story. But for some reason, they didn't publish it until October 26th, weeks after this could have been brought up during the hearings with Brett Kavanaugh, weeks after it was still relevant to the news cycle. They have not explained why they sat on that information. Misquotes obviously are a biggie, especially when they change the context of what someone is saying. We have 2 examples here. I'll talk about the bottom one. The Washington Post claimed that Martha McSally, running for Arizona Senate, accused Kyrsten Sinema of treason. The actual quote was that Martha McSally was asking Kyrsten Sinema if she supported other people's treasonous actions. It's obviously not a huge difference, but one that completely changes the context of the conversation and shows that McSally was never accusing Sinema of treason. The infamous Time magazine cover shows that a picture sometimes does not, in fact, tell the full story. This picture was used, of course, to personify Trump's family separation policy at the border. But as we come to find out, this child was never separated from her mother. She was briefly placed next to her mother while a border agent searched them for weapons, and then they were reunited. Further, they were not seeking asylum, as some news stories claimed. They were looking for economic opportunities. And apparently, the mother in the situation had already been deported from the US before and was thus engaging in a felony by returning. So this picture did not represent what the media claimed that it did, which was a crying, sad child who was separated from her mother. Those people exist, to be clear, but this picture was not an example of it. And by using this as the poster child of the family separation policy, the media shifted the narrative from actually talking about that policy to people being concerned about their own fake news. The Covington Catholic kids, another example of how a short snippet of video or a photograph doesn't always tell the whole story. And I'm going to play a video for you guys that exemplifies what exactly happened here. So the original video, which was, I don't know, approximately 30 seconds long, showed this Covington Catholic student, Nicholas Sandman, seemingly angrily smirking or mocking this Native American elder. And I don't know why the media ran with this. Perhaps they were just trying to find another MAGA supporter to throw under the bus. But regardless of their intentions, the full video showed that the students were waiting for their bus in order to leave the National Mall, and they were apparently harassed and heckled by a group of black nationalists who were shouting racial slurs at them. Nathan Phillips, the Native American elder in this situation, apparently thought it was a good idea to insert himself in that situation and try to come in between the black nationalists and the Covington Catholic boys. He approached the boys first and started beating his drum in their faces. Nicholas Sandman says his response was to stand there silently to show that he was not going to be intimidated and to smile to show that he wasn't interested in having the situation escalate to violence. Obviously, a lot different than what we first thought we saw, which was a group of high school students mocking a Native American man. Speculation and conspiracies are always dangerous. In this case, there was a conspiracy theory about where in the world Melania Trump was, as if she were Carmen Sandiego. And Melania, of course, had a major surgery a little while ago, and she decided to take some recovery time in the White House. But because she wasn't seen at public events for a while, there started this flurry of news stories and speculation on Twitter from so-called journalists who started asking, well, did Melania secretly get plastic surgery or a facelift and she just doesn't want anyone to know? Did she get hit by Donald Trump and is sporting a black eye and now she can't be seen in public? And there were several examples of people doing this. The Atlantic's David Froome was one who did this on Twitter. It wasn't just random people, as some journalists claimed. This graphic itself is from CNN's Brian Stelter's Reliable Sources newsletter. He actually led his newsletter with the caption, "Where is Melania?" with this like spooky-looking calendar with all of the question marks on each day that she hadn't been seen. Funnily enough, on one day that a report went out about where is Melania, she was in the process of speaking at a Gold Star event for families. Publishing uncorroborated stories. It's never a good idea to publish someone's allegation wholesale unless you have some kind of corroborating information. In this case, the New Yorker ran this allegation against Brett Kavanaugh from Deborah Ramirez. And it was really disappointing to see because Jane Meyer and Ronan Farrow are really great journalists who have broken some incredible sexual harassment and sexual assault stories. But this one didn't really live up to their normal hype. Deborah Ramirez herself admitted that she had called several classmates trying to remember if the man who allegedly assaulted her was in fact Brett Kavanaugh, because she herself could not remember. There were no firsthand witnesses, despite this apparently being at a party with half dozen or a dozen other people or so. And the New York Times, in their own report on the New Yorker's story, they said that they called around and they asked a bunch of classmates of Ramirez and Kavanaugh, and they were unable to find one single person who could corroborate the woman's claims. And the New York Times was responsible in this situation because they opted not to run the story until the New Yorker did, because they were unable to corroborate it themselves. And then sometimes there's journalists who just live in full-on fantasy land, like a group of people who claim that Obama never separated families from the border, despite this beautiful photo from Getty during the Obama administration showing all of these unaccompanied migrant children, some of whom had been separated from their families, wrapped in these foil blankets. The good news for all of you is that conservative journalists in many ways have a great advantage in the era of fake news, because they ultimately look at news from a different and unique perspective from what is the prevailing liberal establishment media narrative. Conservative journalists also are really lucky that they have a great opportunity to get sources in the Trump administration with other conservatives who are in high-profile positions. So I think it's good news for you guys if you avoid these mistakes that the establishment media has made, then you likely have a really great career ahead of yourselves. Thank you. I think we have like 5 minutes if anyone has any questions.
So, I mean, these aren't accidents, right? I mean, these are propagandists. You work with these people. They're working on, they have an agenda. They're working on behalf of the, DNC or what, right? Do you believe that?
I am reluctant to speculate on journalists' motivations. I think it's certainly the case that some people have an inherent bias that makes its way into how they conduct themselves and why they choose to publish certain reports and not others, and the way that they frame stories. Sometimes it could be an accident. Sometimes it could be openly malicious. I think that's probably less likely. But when you do have a media that is 85 to 90% Democratic, identifies Democrats or donates to the Clinton campaign, for example, then you're automatically going to have some type of inherent bias that makes its way into your work. And that's why it's important for newsrooms, in my opinion, to make sure that they're having ideological diversity, to make sure that people can catch these types of errors before they're made. Because you can bet if there were a conservative in the room when the New York Times was running this Nikki Haley story, a conservative editor, for example, there's no way that her name would have ever made it into the headline.
What kind of newsrooms exist where that makeup of people is there? I don't believe there are two. Can we come up with some of them?
That's
Unfortunate.
Yeah, it's a good question. I personally like the Wall Street Journal. I like Reuters. I like the Associated Press, even though they were included in here. I think overall they do a good job. CBS News, I think, is relatively fair. ABC sometimes, Brian Ross, bad example of that. But I think there are places where the New York Post, that leans a bit more conservative. But I think there are places where they're making a concerted effort to do this. There are others that I think are kind of deluding themselves by pretending that they're objective or unbiased. But the average person or the right-leaning person can see pretty clearly that their stories do have a slant.
Has the Daily Caller ever made any mistakes of this sort?
Of course, journalists make mistakes all the time.
Any example?
An example, I made a mistake once. I published a story claiming that CNN's Chris Cillizza had purposely photoshopped crosshairs over President Trump, and it turned out that it was actually a byproduct of a GIF maker that he was using. And I apologized for that.
As far as when you get these fake news headlines, is it more of an administrative decision
Each newsroom is different. So at the Daily Caller, most writers offer some version of their own headlines, and then they're tweaked by editors. Sometimes editors write them entirely themselves. I think in the larger newsrooms, editors are probably more responsible for headlines. The Daily Caller is a bit smaller, so we each have a little bit more role in every story that we put out, but it just varies.
Do you guys have any thoughts on the fact checkers that are out there? Everyone from PolitiFact to the Washington Post fact checker, because those are the people making some of the boldest accusations against conservatives for lying, against presidents for lying, but many of them obviously have a political agenda. And so I'm wondering, I mean, obviously you guys have your job to do, but is there anybody out there checking the fact checkers?
Yes, actually. The Daily Caller does a lot of reporting on bogus fact checks, whether it's completely false claims that get rated sort of unverified or uncorroborated. And then we also actually just launched our own fact check site called checkyourfact.org, where we aim to offer an unbiased perspective into fact checking. Obviously, the Daily Caller leans conservative, but our fact check organization, I think personally, is very good and very thorough, and they've been accepted into the Poynter Institute's fact-checking program, so that's a good place to look as well.
I know that DC has a full newsroom, and you have alumni who have gone on to larger media organizations like CNN. I was curious whether you see a place like Breitbart as being sort of a sort of equivalent kind of news organization that leans right, or do you think what they do is a little different from what like the Daily Caller does?
I think Breitbart is a little bit more partisan. I would compare the Daily Caller more to something like the Washington Examiner or the Free Beacon, or maybe even the Times. That's my personal opinion, though, as someone who works there.
So in the White House press corps, how is the job that you do as a conservative journalist different than the job that your colleagues like at CNN or at New York Times?
Yeah, so my goal when I go into the briefing room or when I attend an event is to ask something different than what everyone else is asking, because it kind of seems like when you watch these press conferences, 10 journalists in a row all ask about the same story, or they just ask a different version of the same question. I always try to approach it by having some kind of unique angle that I want to take on the story of the day, or even just asking about something that really isn't in the news but should be, and that could be a number of things. My colleague Sagar and Jetty recently interviewed President Trump, and they asked about the infanticide comments made by Democrats in Virginia, and that was something that the president hadn't yet commented on because he hadn't been asked about it. So there's always opportunities for getting things into the news cycle that conservatives might think are interesting, that our readers want to know about, and it's our role to go in there and make sure that we're asking about that.
Have you found yourselves suppressed by social media at all? Have you looked into that, Facebook, Twitter?
Yes and no. There are some cases of conservative censorship that are very overblown. For example, Project Veritas just came out with this new report claiming that Facebook was artificially suppressing conservative websites. It turns out that was actually a byproduct of a rule that Facebook has, that you cannot post pre-produced videos on a Facebook live stream. So that was why they were being throttled. But there are other cases. For example, Twitter was shadow banning conservatives. So if you would search for them in the search bar on Twitter, then all of these blue check verified conservative journalists were not even being included in the results, despite being the only verified person with that name. And there are some other examples, like I think the Learn to Code hashtag is a good example, because there are people who are legitimately not engaging in targeted harassment campaigns against journalists, and yet if they include any tweet with the hashtag Learn to Code, they're being either suspended or having their accounts blocked by Twitter. So there are definitely, I think, examples of tech censorship, and then there are some others that I think people rush too far because they already believe that it exists, and they include examples that don't really fit that case.
Hey, so I'm curious, I'm curious what you think about the attempts by some media organizations, mainstream media organizations, let's say, criticize, like to hire some people from conservative media. Like, for example, I mean, you know that like CNN had, like two of their on-air White House reporters are people who, you know, came from conservative media. One of them is one of your former colleagues.
Right.
And I think someone else from the Washington Examiner. I guess, do you think that those, I mean, what do you think of those kind of attempts? Do you think that they're like illegitimate, or do you think they're, I guess, what do you make of that?
I obviously appreciate that they're attempting to do that, and I would say Sometimes what the established media does in order to try to like make a faux attempt at ideological diversity is that they will hire never Trump conservatives. Not that those two people are examples of that at all.
Those are reporters.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. Because you have, for example, Jim Sciutto, who's like a former Obama administration official who's anchoring a show, but then they have like some conservative reporters. So does that balance? I don't know, maybe. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious if you think though. I guess when you're talking about the fact that there's like these inherent biases in
Yeah,
these places,
yeah.
there are a lot of people who've come from, people who are your former colleagues, people who, and they're in these other places and they're getting pretty prominent billing. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious to get your perspective on.
Yeah, I guess just my thought is like one or two people doesn't really change the tenor of an organization. And I think a lot of times what happens is that when people do go to the mainstream or establishment media, they tend to sort of meld with the culture that already exists. So it's a lot harder to be an outspoken conservative when all of your colleagues lean more liberal and are all wanting to ask Trump, for example, about the same thing.
Just following on that, there was this outcry, it seemed, among some Democratic candidates after CNN hired
Sarah Flores, yeah.
I'm just curious what you make of that. Is that
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. So my first thought is when I first read about it, I was like slightly confused because she doesn't have journalism experience. So that I didn't fully understand. But considering what her specific role is there, I think it actually makes sense. So she's overseeing some of the editorial decisions in regards to the 2020 campaign. And there are several people at CNN who are in charge of that. So the fact that she was brought in as an open conservative voice to help drive that coverage and hopefully tackle issues that conservatives care about, I think can only be good for CNN.
Keep in mind, she was a never Trumper.
What's that?
Keep in mind that she was actually a never Trumper.
She was, but then she worked in the administration, so who can say? That is true. Sure.
What do you guys do about instances when the president himself is imprecise about the facts, and there are lots of those instances?
Yeah.
Obviously, CNN and other liberal media sources talk about those quite a bit. So as a conservative publications, do you guys have an institutional approach to that, and what do you yourself do individually?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a fact check team dedicated to President Trump like some organizations have. But when we're reporting on what the president says, obviously we make an effort to point out when he's saying something that's inaccurate. And I'll give you an example because I was called out for this on my CPAC speaker announcement. Someone claimed that I was repeating uncritically Trump's claim that he never said that Mexico would directly pay for the border wall. In the story I wrote, in the second paragraph, in fact, I directly said that in materials handed out to reporters during Trump's 2016 campaign, he said that Mexico was going to write a check for the border wall. So that's a great example of how you can report on what the president says, but also add some context and indicate when he is being untruthful. And just because we're conservative doesn't mean that we're not going to challenge Trump or that we're going to repeat everything that he says as if it's factual, because it isn't always, as it is the case with any president. Great, well, I think we're coming up on time anyway. Oh, one more?
There was once a prohibition for Daily Caller on criticizing Fox News. Is that still in place?
There is not an editorial prohibition on criticizing Fox News, no. Yeah.
Do journalists at Daily Caller spread their stories online anywhere, or do they just let Daily Caller traffic drive the stories?
Yeah, I share my stories on Twitter, on my branded Facebook page, et cetera, and most journalists at the organization do.
You just showed us tons of great examples of misinformation, mislabeling, everything that the media does to spread stories that are false or misleading. But the retractions, very few people.
They don't get the same attention, right? Yeah.
People don't see them. In fact, most people I know who follow these news stories still believe them, despite all the retractions and corrections that you showed us. So what can be done? And because those media outlets get so much attention and that feeds upon the people who are wanting to watch it, what incentive do they have to stop? What incentive do they have to actually tell the truth?
Yeah, and that's where I think conservative media comes in, where conservative media critics come in. Before I was a White House correspondent, I was a media reporter, and so it was my job. If you saw the byline on a lot of the examples I shared, it was me, because I was trying to report on these examples so that people were aware of the issues with them, because, as you mentioned, the retractions never get as much attention as the original story, unless it's some major, major bombshell where they do have to go on air and correct themselves in that manner. So I think it's important for conservatives to be constantly calling this stuff out and bringing attention to it, because likely the people who peddle these stories aren't going to do it themselves.
So there's nothing, there is no incentive.
I mean, the only incentive I could think of would be professional repercussions, which a lot of these people don't face. But then, of course, there are other great examples where people do face repercussions, like Brian Ross, for example, who tanked the stock market 500 points with his false report about Michael Flynn. And then he was practically demoted. And then I mentioned the example of the CNN reporters resigning. So there are cases where people are held accountable, but I think there are too many where they aren't, and that's important too.
So you mentioned that Twitter's kind of given a face to the byline and allowed journalists to kind of make a name for themselves. Do you think that's been a net positive or a net negative for the quality of the output?
I think it's been both. Obviously, it's encouraged some journalists, and I'm guilty of this too, of sometimes using the personal brand as opposed to the outlet or the stories that you're writing. And it encourages people to get on TV and make their faces known. But at the same time, it can be really useful, because if people recognize you, they know your face, they know your name, then you have a much easier time getting sources and getting people to share tips with you and talk about stories. Good. All right, great. One more. This will be the last one.
Yeah, based on what he said, would you recommend some sort of location or ground on the internet about, like, these journalists tell lies all the time versus these journalists tell the truth all the time?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it that way. I think there are good journalists who make mistakes. There are journalists who maybe are just actually editorializing the entire time. I wouldn't say that there's like a group of journalists who lie and a group of journalists who don't. I don't think that's really what's going on. I think it's more, as I mentioned, about maybe inherent biases or editorializing when they should be reporting facts. But as a personal plug, the Daily Caller is always reporting on media mistakes and trying to find the facts in these stories and pointing out where the media gets it wrong. So you should definitely follow us if that's something that you're interested in. All right, thank you all.